Eleanor Catherine Marsh sat in the Rowan carriage for 1 hour and 58 minutes before she decided she would not sit for a 59th. She did not weep. She did not send a second note in through the great doors asking after the delay. She did not smooth her skirts for the 10th time and pretend that the waiting did not sting, the way a woman is supposed to pretend such things on the morning she is meant to be married. She opened her father's watch instead, the plain silver one with the scratched case, and she read the time the way she had been taught to read a column of figures, without flinching, without hurry, because a number is a number whether or not you like what it says. 1 hour and 58 minutes. She closed the watch with both hands, the way a person closes a door they intend to remember closing. By the time the county had finished talking about what happened on the Rowan forecourt that morning, they would not be talking about how long a duke had kept a woman waiting. They would be talking about how far she had gone without him, and how little she had seemed to need him to catch her. The spring of 1817 had come to the county early, thawing the roads to mud a full fortnight before anyone expected it, and it was in that mud, on a Tuesday no one thought to mark, that the settlement papers for the marriage of Eleanor Catherine Marsh to Julian Aldrich Vale, Duke of Rowan, were first drawn up in the Belcross solicitor's office. It was not a love match. No one had pretended otherwise, least of all Eleanor. It was, as her father used to say of most arrangements between families with land and families with debts, a matter of accounts that needed balancing. Thomas Marsh had been land agent at Rowan Hall for 22 years, and a good one, the kind of man tenants trusted with their arrears and their grievances, because he wrote everything down, and never once lost a shilling that wasn't his to lose. He had taught his daughter to keep books before he taught her to dance, on the theory, stated often and without apology, that a woman who could read a ledger would never be lied to by a man who could not. A ledger doesn't lie, he told her, over and over, until it wore smooth as a coin in her mind. And neither should you. 6 years ago, the old Duke, Julian's father, had dismissed Thomas Marsh from Rowan Hall on a charge of skimming rents, a charge got up in an afternoon on evidence no one troubled to examine closely, because the man bringing the charge was family, and family was believed the way strangers were not. Thomas Marsh had gone home to his own small freehold, with his name in ruins and his accounts, he swore until his last winter, entirely clean. He died 2 years later of a lung fever that the doctor called ordinary and Eleanor privately called a broken thing that had simply chosen the lungs to break in. The old Duke had died within the same 12-month, and on his own deathbed, by every account that reached her, had spoken of Thomas Marsh's name with something that was not quite an apology, and not quite nothing either. Enough, at least, to leave instructions that his son honour a debt of honour by marrying the disgraced steward's daughter, restoring with a ring what a false charge had taken with a word. Julian Vale had never questioned the arrangement. He had inherited it the way he inherited the title, the debts, and the cousin who managed both, inherited it as a fact of the estate, filed and settled, requiring no more feeling than a boundary stone required feeling. He had met Eleanor exactly 4 times in a year of betrothal. He had found her, on each occasion, perfectly composed, perfectly correct, and had concluded, in the quiet arithmetic of a man raised to distrust anything that could not be entered in a column, that this was precisely what a wife should be. He did not know, because no one had told him, and because he had never thought to ask, that the woman he had concluded so little about had spent that year quietly recopying, from memory, and from a battered private notebook of her father's, every discrepancy in the Rowan Hall accounts she could recall from her girlhood at her father's elbow. She was not doing it out of suspicion of her betrothed. She was doing it, she would have said if anyone had asked, because idle hands invited idle grief, and because her father's name still wanted clearing, and because a ledger, unlike a man, could always be relied upon to eventually tell the truth. On the morning of her wedding, she was brought to Rowan Hall in the family carriage at 9 o'clock, as arranged, to sign the final settlement before the noon ceremony in the chapel. She was shown not into the house, but asked, with an apologetic bow from a footman she did not recognise, to wait in the carriage a few minutes more, as his Grace was occupied with an urgent matter. She waited. The minutes became a quarter hour, then a half, then a full hour, the guests arriving in their good clothes and glancing at the closed carriage with the particular curiosity of people rehearsing a story they will tell for years. At the hour-and-a-half mark, Eleanor opened the carriage door herself, waving off the footman's flustered protest, and walked toward the side terrace, meaning only to ask, plainly, how much longer she was to be kept like a parcel awaiting collection. It was there, beneath the open study window, that she heard her betrothed's voice, and stopped. "You needn't love her, Julian," Aldous Vale was saying, in the mild, reasonable tone he used for everything, the tone that made his cruelties sound like arithmetic. "You need only manage her, as I manage the books. She'll do. Her father kept a tidy ledger, and I dare say she keeps one too, and she'll not trouble you with sentiment." There was a pause, the particular stillness of a man who has been handed an easy sentence and is deciding in real time whether to speak it. Then Julian's voice, tired, flat, final. "She is suitable." That is all this needs to be. Eleanor Catherine Marsh stood very still beneath the window for the length of one full breath. She did not gasp. She did not step back so quickly that her heel caught the gravel. She stood, and she heard the sentence land inside her the way a stone lands in a well, a small sound, and then a very long silence after it, in which she understood with perfect clarity that she had just been priced and found affordable. She turned and walked back to the carriage without hurry, because hurry would have given the moment more of her than it deserved, and because her father had taught her that the worst thing you could hand an enemy, or in this case, an indifferent man behind a window, was evidence that you were bleeding. She climbed in. She took out the watch again, though she already knew the time, because the ritual of it steadied her hands. 1 hour, 58 minutes. She permitted herself silently a count of 10, a fixed ration, no more. That she had been giving her grief since the week her father died. 10 counted breaths, and not one past it. And on the 10th breath she folded the feeling shut like a letter she did not intend to answer today, and set it in the locked drawer of her mind where such letters went, to be read later, on her own schedule, when reading them would cost her nothing she could not afford to spend. Then she leaned forward and rapped twice on the carriage roof. Tam Wicks, who had driven the Rowan carriage for 11 years, and had loved Thomas Marsh the way a man loves an employer, who never once spoke to him as though he were furniture, slid back the little hatch with the face of a man expecting instructions about the church. "Drive on, Tam," Eleanor said. "Not to the chapel. Home." Tam Wicks looked at her for exactly as long as it took to understand that she meant it, and no longer. "Yes, miss," he said, and there was something in the two words that was not quite triumph and not quite grief, but stood very close to both, and he did not ask her a single question the whole 4 miles back to Marsh Farm, which she would remember later as the first kindness anyone had done her that day. Behind them, at Rowan Hall, guests in good clothes stood on the gravel watching a bridal carriage turn its team without slowing and roll away down the avenue, and in the study a settlement paper lay on the desk with a space for a signature that would not, that morning, be filled. Marsh Farm was not large 60 acres of decent land and 40 of indifferent. A stone house with a roof that wanted mending in 2 places, and a name that still meant something to the people who had known her father, and rather less to the people who had only heard, in the last 6 years, the version of his story that Aldersvale's friends preferred to tell. Eleanor arrived home still in her wedding dress, took it off with her own hands rather than ring for help, hung it at the back of the wardrobe where she would not have to look at it, and put on the plain grey wool she wore for accounts. Mrs. Ruth Coulter, who had kept house for Thomas Marsh for 18 years, and had stayed on afterward for no wages Eleanor could spare, found her an hour later at the kitchen table with 3 ledgers open and a 4th being ruled into fresh columns. "You're not crying, Mrs. Coulter said. It was not quite a question. "I had 10 breaths for it," Eleanor said, not looking up. "I've spent them, and what happens when 10 breaths isn't enough? Then I owe myself 10 more, another day." She drew a line under a column and looked at the sum with the flat satisfaction of a woman who has found something to be true, whether or not she likes it. Not today. Today there is a boundary dispute with the fen holding that father never finished settling, and a drainage ditch on the east field that's been silting for 2 years, because nobody with authority troubled to look at it, and a farm that has been managed since father died exactly as badly as a farm manages itself. "You mean to work through it." "I mean to work," Eleanor said. "Whether it goes through me or around me, I haven't decided yet. I expect I'll know by harvest." She did not cry that night, though she lay a long while with the watch in her hand, turning it over, listening to its small, even ticking, which she found she preferred, just then to any human voice she could think of. Josiah Fenn was not a man who trusted easily, and he had less reason than most, having spent 2 years in a slow grinding dispute with the Marsh holding over 11 feet of boundary hedge that both farms claimed, and neither farm's records, as far as he knew, could settle. He came to Marsh Farm 3 days after the wedding that had not happened expecting, he would say later, to find a grieving girl, and an excuse to press his claim while she was too distracted to argue it. He found Eleanor in the east field instead, in boots caked to the ankle, holding her father's old survey chain and a notebook, and she did not offer him tea or condolences. She offered him a number. 11 feet, she said, is what you've claimed, Mr. Fenn, and I want to know where you got it. Because my father's survey of 1809 gives the boundary at the old oak stump, and the stump is 4 feet inside what you're calling the hedge line now. Which means either the hedge has moved, or the story has. Fenn, who had expected tears and got arithmetic, took a moment to recover his footing. "Hedges grow, miss, hedges grow up," Eleanor agreed. "They don't generally grow sideways 4 feet in 8 years without someone's spade helping them along." She held out the notebook, open to her father's original figures, the ink gone brown with age, but the numbers plain as the day they were written. "I'm not accusing you, Mr. Fenn. I'm asking you to walk it with me and tell me what you see, because I'd rather be corrected by a man who knows this ground than be right by accident." It took them the better part of 2 hours. and at the end of it the stump was found, buried under 8 years of leaf mould, exactly where Thomas Marsh had marked it, and Josiah Fenn stood looking down at it with the particular expression of a man revising, in real time, everything he had assumed about a family he thought he understood. "Your father always did keep good papers," he said finally. "He did," Eleanor said. "I intend to." She settled the boundary that afternoon, in writing both their signatures on it, and refused his offer of a bottle of cider by way of apology, asking instead, because a debt repaid in kind was worth more to her than a debt repaid in drink, that he spread the word among the other tenant farms that Marsh Farm was paying its threshers a fair day's wage this harvest, in coin. On the day the work was done, rather than in the usual mix of grudging coin and grudging credit that most of the county's smaller holdings still practised. It was a small thing. She knew it was a small thing. But she had learned, at her father's elbow, that reputation was built the way a wall was built, one stone honestly set at a time, and that a woman with an unravelled wedding and a disgraced father's name had exactly one kind of capital left to spend, which was the plain, dull, unglamorous fact of being right, repeatedly, in front of witnesses. By the end of that month, 3 more boundary questions and 1 dispute over a shared well had been brought to her door, instead of to the county's overworked magistrate. And she had settled every one of them with a chain, a notebook, and the flat, unhurried patience of a woman who did not need to be liked so much as she needed to be believed. Mrs. Coulter began referring to her, without apparent irony, as the surveyor, and the name stuck around Belcross Market before autumn. It was during a review of her father's old private notebook, the one he had kept separate from the official Rowan Hall accounts. A habit she had thought at first was simple thoroughness, that she found the first irregularity that was not about her own boundaries at all. A column of figures for tenant rents collected in the year before her father's dismissal did not match, by some £11, the sum he had reported to the estate as received. £11 was not a fortune. It was, however, exactly the kind of number that did not appear by accident, and exactly the kind of number her father would have flagged, rather than buried, which meant he had known, and had likely said so, and had been dismissed within the season for a charge that accused him of the very thing someone else appeared to be doing. She copied the discrepancy into a fresh page of her own, and did not mention it to anyone, not yet. A number without a witness was only a suspicion. She meant, when the time came, to have both. It was a letter that reached her first, not a man, a folded note delivered by a Rowan Hall footman 3 weeks later, in a hand she recognised from the settlement papers she had never signed, asking, with a formality that fooled no one, whether Miss Marsh would receive his grace at Marsh Farm, at her convenience regarding a matter of business. She read it twice, folded it along its existing creases, and set it beneath the paperweight on her father's old desk, where it sat for 4 days before she answered it at all. The matter of business, it turned out, was not business in the least, and Eleanor understood this within the first minute of Julian Vale standing in her small parlour, with his hat in both hands, turning it by the brim the way a boy turns a thing he does not know what to do with. "I have come to apologise," he said. "You've come to explain," Eleanor said. "Those are different, Your Grace. I heard both offered under that study window, and I know the sound of each. An apology costs you something now. An explanation only costs you the trouble of talking." He looked at her the way a man looks at a sum he has added twice and gotten a different answer each time. "Then let me try again. I kept you waiting 2 hours because my cousin manufactured an urgent claim against the estate that morning, and I chose, as I have chosen for 6 years, to believe him before I troubled to question him. And when he said what he said about you through that window, I did not correct him, because correcting him would have meant admitting out loud that I had married for a reason I was ashamed to name and had never once considered whether it was enough for you. And was it? Enough for you? No, he said, and it came out of him badly, the way true things sometimes did when a man was unpractised at saying them. It was never enough. I told myself suitable was safer than the alternative, because the alternative had cost my father everything he had, and I had watched it happen from the staircase when I was 8 years old, and I decided somewhere in that watching that I would never again build a house on a feeling that could walk out the front door. Something in her chest moved at that. Not forgiveness. Not yet, but the particular recognition of a wound she had not asked to see and could not now unsee. She did not let it reach her face. "That is an explanation, Your Grace," she said. "I have not yet heard the other half." He was quiet a moment. Started again. "I am sorry. Not sorry that it was awkward, or sorry that the county is talking. Sorry that I let a man who has never once done an honest day's work near my books tell me what you were worth, and sorry that I believed him faster than I would have believed you, whom I had actually met." "All right," Eleanor said, and it was not forgiveness either. It was a receipt, nothing more. An acknowledgement that a payment had been made and logged. "Then here is what I require, if you mean to come again. Not tonight. Not with more words, which cost you nothing you haven't already spent. Show me. Over time. In front of people who have no reason to lie to me about what they saw." He nodded, slowly, the way a man nods at a debt whose terms he cannot argue with because he recognizes they are fair. Then, before he could think better of it, he reached inside his coat and drew out nothing, an empty hand, turned palm up. "I own I do not carry a watch," he said. "I never have. I was raised to think punctuality was a servant's virtue, something managed by other people on your behalf. I begin to understand that was a mistake." Eleanor considered him a long moment, then drew her father's watch from her pocket, the one that had counted her own 2 hours to the minute, and set it in his open palm, closing his fingers around it herself before he could refuse it. "Then learn to keep it," she said. "Not for me. For every hour you've spent letting other people decide what your time was worth, bring it back when you've earned the right to. And if I don't earn it, then you'll have a very fine watch, Your Grace, and no further business at Marsh Farm." He left with it still in his hand, turning it once in his fingers at the gate, the way she had turned it herself the morning of her wedding. And Eleanor stood in the doorway, watching the carriage go, aware of a small unfamiliar warmth beneath the locked drawer of her mind, and aware, too, that she had no intention of opening that drawer before she had to. The evidence came together the way most true things came together in Eleanor's experience, which was to say slowly, and mostly through other people's honesty rather than her own cleverness. It was Mrs. Coulter turning out an old trunk of Thomas Marsh's effects that had sat untouched in the loft since his death, who found the second notebook, bound in the same plain calfskin as the first, but labelled, in her father's careful hand, only with a date, 1804 to 1811. It was not a duplicate of the estate's official rent rolls. It was a shadow of them, kept in parallel, every sum Thomas Marsh had personally collected from every tenant on the Rowan Hall lands, cross-checked in his own hand against what the estate's official books, kept jointly by him and by young Aldous Vale, installed as assistant steward that same year, at the direction of an aging duke who wanted a family member learning the business. Showed as received. The gaps began small, £2 here, 4 there. By 1810 they had widened into a pattern too regular to be error, sums that matched exactly what Aldous Vale's own signature had logged as arrears written off, tenants who, questioned discreetly by Eleanor and Fenn over the following fortnight, swore they had paid every shilling owed and had the receipts, in several cases, to prove it. He wasn't skimming carelessly, Eleanor said to Mrs. Coulter one evening. The 2 notebooks opened side by side on the kitchen table, candlelight throwing their columns into sharp black relief. He was skimming carefully, and writing off the difference as tenant debt that was never truly owed, and when my father noticed the pattern and said so, it was easier to accuse the man who noticed than the man who was guilty. A ledger doesn't lie. It only waits for someone patient enough to read it. She took the notebooks to Mr. Pell, the Belcross solicitor who had drawn up her father's original agency contract, and, years before that, had liked Thomas Marsh well enough to keep his own private doubts about the dismissal to himself rather than voice them without proof. Pell was a precise, unhurried man who read the columns twice, asked 11 exact questions, and said finally, "This is not proof of theft, Miss Marsh. It is proof of a discrepancy. Proof of theft requires a document in his hand that cannot be explained any other way." "Then I'll find one," Eleanor said. She did not have to look far. Among the arrears entries, one stood out for its size, £23, written off against a tenant named Wexley who had, Fenn confirmed within a day's asking, died in 1809 and left no family to dispute the claim on his behalf. The write-off was dated 8 months after the man's death, and it bore, in the margin, a small looping signature Eleanor recognised instantly, because she had watched Aldous Vale sign the same flourish on a dozen public documents since. A dead man's arrears, forgiven 8 months after there was no one left alive to have owed them, by the one man with access to both the collection and the ledger. She was still copying the entry that same week when the smear reached Belcross ahead of her, a letter, unsigned, circulated first among the shopkeepers, and then, inevitably, to the vicar's wife, alleging that Thomas Marsh's daughter had produced forged papers of her own in a desperate bid to clear a father who had in fact died owing the estate a debt he had never repaid. Eleanor read the copy Mrs. Coulter brought her from the baker's window, without any visible change in her face at all. "They've moved fast," Mrs. Coulter said, watching her. "They've moved exactly as I expected," Eleanor said. "A man who forges a dead tenant's arrears doesn't wait patiently to be found out. He gets ahead of the finding." She folded the smear letter once, precisely, and set it beneath the paperweight beside Julian's first note, which she had never quite thrown away. Quarter day is in 11 days. Every tenant on the Rowan lands will be in that yard to pay their rents and hear the year's accounting read aloud, the way it's always done. I intend to be there too. You've not been asked. No, Eleanor agreed. I intend to go anyway. Quarter day at Rowan Hall had always been held in the old threshing yard behind the stables, tenants queuing with their rent boxes while the steward read the year's figures aloud from the estate steps, a ritual as fixed in the county's calendar as harvest itself. This year the yard was fuller than usual, because word had travelled the way word always travelled in a county, with more curiosity than occupation, and by the time Eleanor arrived on foot with Mrs. Coulter at her elbow, and the 2 notebooks in a plain leather satchel. There were faces at the yard's edge that had no rent to pay, and no reason to be there beyond wanting to see what happened next. Aldous Vale stood on the steps in his good coat, rent rolls in hand, and did not so much as pause his reading when Eleanor came through the gate. "Miss Marsh," he said, without looking up, "I'm afraid this is estate business." "It is," Eleanor said. "That's why I've come." Julian was there too, at the top of the steps, and she saw him register her arrival the way a man registers a change in weather, a small stillness, a hand that stopped halfway to his coat pocket, where she guessed, without needing to check, that her father's watch now lived. He did not send her away. That, she noted, was itself an answer to a question she had not asked aloud. "Mr. Vale," Eleanor said, pitching her voice to carry the length of the yard without shouting, because she had learned that a voice that did not need to shout was believed faster than one that did. "I wonder if you might explain an entry from the year 1809. A write-off of £23 against a tenant named Wexley, for arrears you record as unpaid at the time of his death." "I don't carry 8 years of rolls in my head, Miss Marsh." "I do," Eleanor said, and drew the notebook from her satchel, opening it to the marked page. "Because my father kept a private record alongside the official one, the whole time he served as agent here, and his figures show Wexley's account settled in full the spring before he died, which means the £23 you wrote off 8 months after his death was never owed by anyone living, and never collected from anyone at all. It went, Miss Vale, precisely nowhere, except, I think, into an account of your own. The yard had gone very quiet, the particular quiet of a crowd deciding, in real time, which version of events it meant to believe. Aldous' mouth performed a smile that did not reach the rest of his face. A private record kept by a disgraced steward is hardly evidence, Miss Marsh. Sentiment is not proof. No, Eleanor agreed. But a signature is. She turned the notebook so the yard could see the looping flourish in the margin, then drew from the satchel a second paper. A receipt Josiah Fenn had produced 2 days prior from his own strongbox, showing a payment made to Aldous Vale personally, in the same hand, for a debt Fenn had never in fact been told the origin of, only informed it must be paid quietly, or his lease would not be renewed. "I paid it because I was told to," Fenn said, stepping forward from the crowd without being asked, his voice rough but steady, and Eleanor had not planned that, had not arranged it, and understood in that instant that this, an honest man volunteering his own cost without being made to, was worth more to the yard's opinion than every column she had copied. 2 years running. Told it were arrears left from my father's time. I never saw the figure on any roll Mr. Vale read out at quarter day, only ever saw it in his hand, private, in his own study. A second tenant murmured agreement. A third. The particular stillness in Aldous Vale's face was the stillness of a man watching a wall he had built stone by careful stone come apart faster than he could reach the gaps. "You have no notion what you're accusing me of," he said, and his voice, for the first time, was not mild. "I have every notion," Eleanor said. "I'm accusing you of taking what wasn't yours, and letting an honest man's name carry the blame for it, the way you've let it carry that blame for 6 years, while you slept easily under this roof. I am not asking the county to hang you for it, Mr. Vale. I am asking it to look." It was Mr. Pell, standing at the yard's edge with the quiet authority of a man whose word the county actually trusted, who confirmed what Eleanor already suspected, that the date on the Wexley write-off fell during a fortnight, when Aldous Vale's own travel receipts, filed with the estate for reimbursement, placed him 60 miles distant in Bath, a fact no one had troubled to cross-reference until a woman with 2 ledgers and nothing left to lose had asked him to. "You signed a document," Pell said, "in a county you were not in, on a date you can prove by your own paper you were elsewhere." "That is not sentiment, Miss Vale. That is forgery." Something behind Aldous Vale's eyes went out then, the particular extinguishing of a man who understands, all at once, that the version of himself he had spent a decade constructing has just been read aloud, correctly, in front of everyone he had built it for. Julian came down the steps at last, and the yard turned to watch him the way it had turned to watch everything else that morning, and Eleanor understood that whatever he said next would matter more to the county's memory of this day than anything she herself had produced. "My cousin has managed the accounts of this estate since before I could read them myself," Julian said. "And I have trusted him the way a man trusts a habit, without troubling to ask whether the habit had earned it. That trust ends today. What happens to him next will happen through Mr. Pell's proper channels, and not through this yard's anger, however well earned that anger is." He looked at Eleanor then, and something in his face was not composure at all, but she noted it the way she noted everything, carefully, and without comment. Yet Miss Marsh's father was dismissed from this estate on a lie that has cost him his name for 6 years past his death. I mean to see that name entered back into these rolls the way it should always have stood. Mercy, Aldous said bitterly, from the boy who let me manage his affairs for a decade, without once asking a hard question. "Not mercy for your sake," Eleanor said, before Julian could answer. "Ruin does not fill a tenant's larder, Mr. Vale, and prosecution will cost this estate 2 years of scandal it can ill afford, while these people are owed a fair harvest. You will repay what the rolls show taken, in full, over such term as Mr. Pell sets, and you will do it from wherever you go next, because you will not do it from here. That is not forgiveness, that is arithmetic. I find I still prefer it to revenge." Aldous Vale looked at her for a long moment, the woman his mild cruelty had once priced as suitable and nothing more, and said nothing at all, which was, Eleanor thought, the first honest thing she had ever heard from him. Julian found her that evening at Marsh Farm, the quarter-day dust still on his boots, and this time he did not stand turning his hat by the brim in the doorway. He sat, when she gestured him to, and set her father's watch on the table between them, still ticking, still wound. "I've kept it 3 months," he said. "I did not miss an appointment once, in the end, though I confess I checked it perhaps 40 times a day for the first fortnight, the way a man checks a wound to see if it's healing." "Is it?" "I don't know yet. I know I want to explain the rest of it to you properly, not the shorthand version I gave you in your parlour. My mother left when I was 8, not died, left, on a Tuesday morning, with 2 trunks and a note my father burned before I ever read it, and the household never spoke of her again by anything but the pronoun she, as though naming her might bring her back, and no one wanted that risk taken. My great-uncle Edmund raised me for the better part of 2 years after, and his particular doctrine, the one Aldous grew up reciting like a catechism, because Edmund raised him too, was that attachment is a ledger entry you cannot balance. Love someone, and you hand them the power to leave a hole in your accounts you'll spend the rest of your life trying to fill. "Marry for use," he said, "and you will never again be made a fool of the way my father was made a fool of, loving a woman who could simply walk out a door. And you believed him." "I built my whole life on believing him," Julian said. "It was easier than the alternative. I married suitability, because suitability, I told myself, could not leave. I did not understand until I watched you drive away from your own wedding, without so much as raising your voice, that a person who does not need you can leave just as easily as a person who does. The only difference is whether you notice in time to matter. He was quiet a moment. Started again, the words coming slower now, costing him more. I am sorry, Eleanor, not the study window kind of sorry, that costs a man nothing but breath. The kind that requires me to say, out loud, that I priced you the way Aldous priced a dead man's arrears, as a sum that was convenient to write down and never once looked at properly. Eleanor sat with that a long moment, turning her father's maxim over in her mind the way she turned the watch. A ledger doesn't lie. Nor, she thought, had this. It was the fullest accounting she had yet had from him, and an accounting, she found, was worth considerably more to her than any speech. That is the apology, she said. I'll take it. Now here are my terms, and I'd have you hear them as terms, not as sentiment, because I find sentiment travels badly, and terms tend to hold. He nodded, and did not reach for his hat, which she took as a good sign. Marsh Farm remains mine, she said in my own name, whatever else happens between us, held separate from any settlement, because I will not again be a woman whose only property is her husband's good opinion. Rowan Hall's accounts will carry 2 signatures from this day forward, mine alongside whoever you appoint honest in Aldous' place, because I have found I trust a document more than I trust a promise, and I see no reason that should change simply because the promise is now yours. And you will never again decide, in a closed room, with another man's voice, instead of mine in the room to correct him, what I am worth. If you have a question about my worth, Julian, you will bring it to me. All right, he said. All right, then, Eleanor said, and something in the plainness of the exchange, 2 words twice over, the whole treaty of it, settled between them more firmly than any speech either of them could have made. He left the watch on the table when he rose to go, and when she looked a question at him, he only said, I'd like to earn the right to carry it a while longer yet. But I thought you might want to know I could give it back, that I wasn't keeping it because I couldn't. She did not stop him at the gate this time. She stood in the doorway and watched the carriage go, and reached, without entirely deciding to, for the locked drawer of her mind, and found, to her own mild surprise, that she had let herself feel the whole of it, not 10 counted breaths' worth, but all of it, unrationed, standing in her own doorway with no one there to see, which she understood, distantly, was the first time in longer than she could easily say that she had allowed herself grief without a ceiling on it. The weeks that followed did not announce themselves as anything remarkable, which was, Eleanor came to think, rather the point. He came Tuesdays at first, then Tuesdays and Thursdays, riding over from Rowan Hall with estate papers under his arm, as though Marsh Farm's kitchen table had simply become the place such papers were properly reviewed. He did not sit at the head of it. He drew a second chair beside hers, not across from her, the first time he came, and said nothing about the choice, and she noticed it the way she noticed everything, filed it without comment, and found 3 visits later that the chair had simply stayed there, as though it had always belonged. Mrs. Coulter began, without being asked, to set 2 cups when she heard his horse on the lane, and he took to pouring Eleanor's before his own, unasked, which she also noticed, and did not remark upon, because some accumulations were worth more unremarked than praised. The watch came back to her in October, on a Tuesday, set on the table between them the way it had been set the first time, except that when she opened the case this time she found, engraved inside the lid in careful small letters that had clearly cost the jeweller in Belcross, some patience, a line that was not her father's maxim, and not quite his own either, kept, and worth the keeping. "I had it done the week after quarter day," Julian said. "I've been slow bringing it back because I wanted to be sure I'd earned the right. And I confess I still am not entirely sure. But I thought a man could go on, checking his own arithmetic forever, and never hand in the sum. There was one slip, in November, that she named for what it was rather than let pass. A cottage on the eastern boundary needed a new roof before winter, and Julian, hearing of it from the estate carpenter on a morning Eleanor was occupied with her own accounts, simply ordered the repair and the payment for it without sending word to Marsh Farm at all, an old habit, deciding alone, moving fast, because moving fast had once been the only way he knew to move. "You didn't ask me," Eleanor said that evening, not sharply, only plainly, the way she named every discrepancy she found. He stopped, started again. "I didn't think of it as a decision that required you. It felt like ordinary estate business." "It is ordinary estate business," Eleanor said. "Which is exactly why it should have come through both our hands." "The large wounds are easy to notice, Julian. It's the ordinary decisions, made alone out of old habit, that tell me whether anything's actually changed." He was quiet a long moment, and this time he did not defend it. "You're right. I'll bring the next one to you first, even if it costs me a day I could have saved." He did, the following week, and a week after that, and by the time the first snow came to the county, the two-signature line on the Rowan Hall ledgers had become, without either of them remarking on it, simply the way the estate's business was done. It was by the fire one evening in December, the ledgers closed for the night, and the watch ticking quietly on the mantel where it had come, by unspoken agreement, to live, that Julian said, without any particular ceremony, the thing she had been waiting to hear him earn the right to say. "I would choose you," he said. "Not as a debt of honour my father left me, and not as the suitable answer to an arrangement I never questioned. I have been choosing you, I think, since the morning you drove away and left me standing on my own gravel understanding, for the first time in my life, what it costs to be left by someone who has finally decided you are not worth the waiting. I have been choosing you every Tuesday since, and I mean to keep choosing you on every ordinary day left to me, if you'll let the choosing continue." Eleanor considered him a long moment, the fire between them, the watch ticking its small, even count on the mantel, and found, when she searched the locked drawer of her mind, that there was nothing left in it that needed hiding from him. "Then I accept the choosing," she said, on the terms already agreed. "Nothing more is owed beyond that. Nothing less will do either." 2 years later, the road to Marsh Farm was no longer mud a fortnight before anyone expected it, because Julian had ordered it properly drained the first autumn of their marriage, on Eleanor's recommendation, and with her signature beside his on the estate order. The farm itself had grown to include the old fen boundary dispute land, purchased outright and fairly, and had become, in the county's own vocabulary now, rather than Mrs. Coulter's, simply the model holding, the place where every tenant on the Rowan lands was paid in coin, on the day the work was done, a practice that had spread, over 2 harvests, to every farm the Duke of Rowan's name touched. A small schoolhouse stood now at the crossroads outside Belcross, built with Rowan Hall funds and Marsh Farm's own, bearing over its door a plain stone plaque that read only Thomas Marsh, land agent, 1794-1815. No epitaph beyond the fact of his years and his work. Because Eleanor had decided, when the builder asked what more should be carved, that a man who had spent his whole life letting the numbers speak for him should not, in the end, be handed different rules. Aldous Vale wrote twice yearly from a modest situation in the north, where he had taken a clerk's post under Mr. Pell's quiet arrangement and a debt schedule that would not clear for another 6 years. His letters were opened, read for the remittance enclosed, and answered by Eleanor's own hand, briefly and without cruelty, because she had found, in the 2 years since quarter day, that cruelty cost more to carry than it was ever worth collecting. The watch no longer lived in anyone's pocket. It hung now on a small brass hook beside the front door of Rowan Hall, where every visitor could see it, wound each morning by whichever of them woke first, its engraved lid catching the hall light the way a thing catches light, when it has finally been allowed to sit in the open rather than be hidden in a drawer against grief. The house itself, callers remarked without quite knowing why they remarked it, no longer held the particular held-breath quiet it once had. It had begun, somewhere in the last 2 years, simply to breathe. She had not stopped asking to be seen because someone had finally granted the asking. She had stopped because she had made herself, one honest column at a time, impossible to unsee, not because a duke had chosen her, but because she had first chosen herself, on a muddy gravel forecourt, with a coachman's 2 words for an answer and a watch counting the minutes in her hand. Love, when it came only after, not the rescue that answers a woman's waiting, but the verdict a man finally becomes fit to render. And that, once earned, was not a thing that could ever again be left waiting at anyone's door.